Good morning, everybody. Today's topic is the idea of ego, and I'm introducing it this week because I want to begin to use this as a springboard to start to discuss it. Sarah Whitehead is also going to have some presentations about the 5 wisdoms, the 5 Buddha families, which is always a really exciting and kind of beautifully interactive subject. It's one of my favorites ever. And it's like studying the idea of ego and how ego is structured and creates itself is a decent requisite for springboarding toward that. But I also think it's really good practical teaching for us. You could look at ego in a number of ways. The old Freudian way is it's an aspect of the psychology that assigns our identity or a belief in who we are. And it does so in a number of different schemas or strategies that it uses. The Buddhist point of view is that it's like a mask. It's not really us. It's a fabrication that we create to make ourselves acceptable to whatever milieu we're doing. And the interesting thing is that you might feel as though you've got a consistent sense of self. There's you, because we don't really investigate it and we don't really look at it. So we just take for granted there's this me, and this me is always got a list of complaints, and this me has a list of joys, and this me is happy sometimes and unhappy sometimes. But we never look into that to really see what it is that's generating this idea of me and how much of that is really real and how much of that is really dependent upon circumstances such as how people treat us or what the weather is or how good we feel. That might sound a little facetious, but in fact, I'm someone that gets very affected by the weather and the humidity. I won't even know why I'm in a crappy mood and everything seems to be not working. And then I'll look at the temperature and realize it's 89 degrees and it's high humidity and I'm just feeling really sort of stuck. But the whole time I thought it was about me, and somehow take the whole weather thing a little bit personally, which is kind of interesting. The masks that we use to make ourselves negotiate our life, to allow us to negotiate our life, are not really who we are. And who we are is an interesting question. Really, who is that anyway? I think, therefore I am thinking. I think would be a Buddhist point of view. What we're thinking doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of what our identity is. It's what we think our identity is, maybe. And a lot of our thoughts, this is why with meditation, we try, and in the guided meditation, try to seduce people out of those same thoughts. Somebody said today that they thought the guided meditation was distracting them. I wonder what they were being distracted from now. From what? From our same old thoughts, thinking the same old things, so that we can feel the same way consistently about ourselves. Is that what we're doing with meditation? Are we sitting there trying to create more of a point of view that's solid and truthful to this idea of ourselves? If we were to do that, then we would be limited for the whole rest of our life to just what we already know. That would be it. We are just reiterating and reiterating what we already know. We're having the same arguments with the same people, the same unhappiness in the same ways, the same situations over and over again. And as Albert Einstein pointed out, those experiments are not working, and yet we're still doing them, which is the definition, as they say, of insanity, or very specifically, what Freud would say, neurosis. Doing things to achieve a result that are counter to achieving that result, doing the very things that make the result really impossible. We're looking for happiness, but our ego only really understands very block-like and rudimentary concepts based on whatever relationship it was designed for. You don't even realize it, but you have a completely different ego structure now than you did probably just 30 seconds ago, but certainly 5 or 6 hours ago, in a different relationship at a different time. Because the ego is trying to get something out of every situation. Every situation to an ego is transactional. It wants you to feel sorry for it. So it tells a story in a way that makes you feel sorry. It wants you to feel proud of it. So it says things and posits things in a way. We're constantly giving ourselves away because it's more important in that moment for us to be considered in a certain way, according to our ego. We don't want to hear feedback that might actually lead us to some kind of growth. We don't really want things to change for ourselves. The ego doesn't. Of course, we all do. And we're all willing to grow and to open and to hurt a little bit, to stretch our heart, to move out of the cocoon a little bit. But our ego is always resisting that because its structure is to keep things in stasis. Its structure is to keep things here. I have this mask. And the mask subsumes a certain list of behaviors, certain ways that I would act and react. Anyway, one teacher I had once said, I don't know why you're discussing ego so much because ego doesn't exist. So what's the point? But the interesting thing is we believe it exists and we act as though it exists. And so we create a world of pain for ourselves because we're not able to satisfy our real basic needs because we're always involved in these imaginary ideas of aggrandizement or the opposite of aggrandizement, which is just as much ego when we think that we're horrible and we feel as though we're at fault and we feel guilty. The kind of bipolar swings. And in a way, ego exists in the extremes of our mind. When we're really amped up, there's a lot of ego there. When we're really depressed, think about it. It's so sad when we're depressed, and I don't want to sound lacking in compassion, but if you really look at your depression, there's a lot of self-centeredness there. There's a lot of you thinking about you, me thinking about me during that depression. When we feel great, it's really all about us. The Buddha talked about the middle way, this idea, this space that exists between those extremes, between being the king of the universe and the queen of complete defeat, between being the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world, which are ego states, projections that we want to create a certain reaction in the audience or in the world. But the middle way doesn't really have any of that. What could be more humble, more direct, less egotistical than just coming back to the breath and being present with the breath? Yeah, we don't want to be distracted from our beautiful reverie, but that may be a very closed system. If we could train ourselves to just punctuate that a little bit, just burst the bubble a little bit and come back to that middle ground of just ourselves and the breath, we would create this space in our brain that allows us to access much more context to things. That context allows us to have a situation where we're not constantly reacting. We're not triggered and reacting. We're not stuck in that loop. We're actually, as meditators, gaining this sense of head and shoulders, Trungpa Rinpoche would say, this sense of creating dignity and space in our world so that we get triggered and we acknowledge it. And maybe we just let go enough, not that we let go completely if it's something that has to be addressed, but we let go just enough that our reaction turns into a considered response. So when we talk about letting go, we're not saying, okay, somebody slapped us in the face, so we should turn the other cheek. That's an ego statement. That's another ego statement because it's trying to get some kind of reaction. But what we're saying is when we're slapped in the face, to just pause for a moment, to just breathe out and come back to you and the middle way, and trust that the appropriate response will be there. And if it's slapping back, then that's maybe the appropriate response. But if it's a knee-jerk response, we're always operating with the lights out. We're not paying attention. Our eyes are closed. I used to be really, really frightened of heights. I'm not so much anymore because I just don't put myself in that position. I imagine I'm still frightened of heights. But I had some really terribly unmasculine, embarrassing moments for myself when I was being encouraged by other people to just reach out and grab the next rock. And I would panic and then scramble up the cliff in some completely, inelegant way, or scramble and jump off the side of a cliff or something without even paying attention because I was more frightened of the height than I was of trying to be smart about how I landed. Any number of ways that I could have actually even hurt myself worse, closing my eyes because I was so fearful of the heights, so fearful of the danger, but it was completely neurotic because I only made it more dangerous for myself. That's an example that sounds extreme, but think of how often we do that very thing. We just want something so badly, we close our eyes and just leap for it, grab it, and not in a way that is considered or even intelligent, let alone elegant and human. So to some extent, the practice of meditation is teaching us to be human, to be awake and present ourselves to the world in a way that we have authority, that we have space, that we command attention, but not for ego reasons, because we've manipulated all of these things, but simply because we're comfortable in ourselves and comfortable to be able to sit in the middle way. And in the book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about how if we don't, well, Pema would say bite the hook, but if we don't jump off the spot and actually try to fix reality, if we are able to just stay with the breath and stay with ourselves, that we develop a spiritual maturity. We develop an ability to just be present and not be fooled by our own mind constantly. Ego thinks it's getting its way, and it actually makes us a sucker over and over again. We can't just get rid of ego. It's a structure that's so ingrained in our system, and also community ego, a structure that's ingrained in our society and our culture. But what we could begin to do is see through it, is create that space I was talking about between ourselves and a reaction. And that space, which comes from the middle way, that space which comes from not falling into extremes, that space which comes from holding our seat, gives us the perspective to see beyond ego, which means we could use ego when we need to and let it go when we need to, or recognize that the ego we have with one person is quite different than the mask we wear with another. We begin to be able to be in control of the process rather than continually controlled by the process. Now, for most of us, that's a bit ways off. There's some practice between now and then. But what's important is that we disabuse our view that this idea that we don't even look at ourselves is a self, and we've never really questioned it, is something we could begin to look at if we want to consider ourselves serious about meditation. Because meditation isn't about making your life a more pleasant, dishonest fiction. Meditation is about exposing the fiction. and being able to see the truth. The cornerstone of the teachings on the ego is that if we could see how it's constructed, rather than see the stories or the narratives, if we actually began to see the structure of how it works, we could begin to disabuse ourselves of the notion that there's a real being here. It's just a function, it's just a fabrication, it's just a story. So what the Buddha thought is that if we could deconstruct that story, it would be helpful in creating that separation I was talking about, to where we have that space between action and response, right? And what the Buddha did was he saw that we had different layers of this personality that came together in the entire picture of the personality, so to speak. He was asked by one of his students, what comprises the self, or what is a self? And the Buddha had happened to be in a kitchen, and there was rice there, and he took a heap of rice and he put one heap there, and then he created what's called a mandala. The classic mandala would have one heap in the middle and 4 heaps in the cardinal corners, so 5-pointed mandala, and 5 piles of rice. And these piles of rice, each comprised of countless grains of rice. So they're not solid things, but they're lots of different things that organize into these 5 different stages. The 5 stages of ego, if you're interested, are translated in a lot of different ways depending on the teacher or the tradition, but coming from the tradition I learned in, the first skandha is the skandha of form. And the color is white, and the feeling is that you are real. That's the very first, the cornerstone of ego, that there's this sense that you're real. Trungpa Rinpoche said it's like you have a beach at the ocean, and one grain of sand decides to stick its head up and go, me, me. There's a great cartoon with Gary Larson, if you remember those Far Side single panel cartoons. They're really brilliant, with all these penguins and, you know, like going across the plains in Antarctica, and one penguin going, I gotta be me. You know, so the foundation of ego is this idea that I, that's form, that becomes real, that I'm all of a sudden real because I'm not connected to everything else. I'm separate from everything else. Nobody gets me, nobody understands me. I'm unique and individual. And of course, our entire culture is built on that idea. But so is the idea of ego, and so is a whole world of pain that we create. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying it's the foundation, and the very next thing is I want, that we're beginning a relationship, form, feeling, the sense that we want something, that there's something that we want, or we want to not have something. We're starting to come out of the fog of being part of everything and create this individualistic statement. And the first foundation of ego is this blanket ignorance that we are separate than everything else. And the second one is that then we need something else. And the third is perception, form, feeling, perception. And perception is when we begin to categorize between 3 primary, I want to say poles, poles would be 2, but 3 primary basic tenets, which are considered to be the 3 poisons, they're called. This is the root of all our discomfort and uncomfortableness. I'm translating them as passion, aggression, and ignorance. Yes, no, I don't care. Positive, negative, neutral, right? passion, aggression, and ignorance. And that everything you're thinking right now, everything you've thought of all day falls into one of these categories. And these categories actually funnel our feelings before we've even realized we have a thought. This is all still pre-thought. I want to like, I want to dislike, or I want to ignore. We fall into one of those three categories. The next fourth skandha is our emotional world, our conceptual world, the framework that we put everything in. And all of this is before a conscious thought. We already have a feeling, right, that's going to prejudice the thought. So this is why the egoic mind is not spontaneous. The egoic mind is not wisdom. The egoic mind is not connected to anything else but its own projections. Because by the time it gets to the fifth skandha, which is our conceptual mind and our senses and our connection to the world, it's already had this feeling of me, and that you need something, and that you feel good, bad, or neutral about it. And then it's gone into a category of one of these five major emotional types. We're going to study the five wisdom energies in a coming weeks, either next week or the week after, and depending on where it goes today. But these five basic energy groups that happen in the fourth skandha kind of give us a sense of the coloring of our whole world before we've even really made contact to it. So we walk into a date and we already feel lonely and pissed off and irritable about the restaurant and everything else in our experience before we've even said hello. We've gone through this entire process. The fifth stage of skandha is the conceptual mind, the 8 consciousnesses, and the way that we actually begin to formulate and communicate with our world. The reason the Buddha wanted people to discuss these heaps, skandhas mean heaps, these different structures that create the structure of our ego, is so that we could pierce the bubble of belief in these things. At some point, you're hurting, and that's a wake-up call. And the first thing ego wants to do is blame someone. Well, this is the person that doesn't understand me, or this is the waiter that didn't take my thing, or this is because the car was late, or we have this list of reasons why we're uncomfortable instead of just paying attention to what's actually happening. That's the resolution to the whole ego game. All we have to do is stop. Not forever, not for good, but just for a moment, a gap. Cessation of suffering can be seen, and I think traditionally is seen, as an end game, a big end of our suffering, but it can more realistically be seen as these moments of gap that exist all the time. All of a sudden, there's no me, there's just a moment. Maybe it happens when you're surfing, maybe it happens when you're rock climbing, maybe it happens making love. There are 4 times that the Buddhist teachings point to when we are in a completely egoless state, when we're completely awake, and that is at birth, at our death, during an orgasm, and during a sneeze. True story. And if you think about it, the sneeze sets the whole paradigm for the whole thing up, because the sneeze short circuits your whole system. For a second, right after the sneeze, you don't really exist. And then, of course, we put it all together again to create the relationship. One example I like a lot, I'll close with this cute stories. I had a cat that was really bad at all the cat stuff. Anything a cat would normally do, he was just terrible at. He had acne, he was lazy, he was a terrible hunter. He would do things like leap after a mouse on a rock wall. He did this over and over again and never learned from it. He'd leap after the mouse would hide in the rock wall. He would fall off the side and crash on the ground 4 feet down. He would just like lose his crap, right? But the point of ego is, as soon as he did that, and you've seen cats do this before, whenever they mess up, the very next thing they do is start cleaning themselves and start putting their skandhas back together, right? And think about how many times we do that. We get caught short, and there's this moment when we don't exist. We don't know who we are. There's like somebody's left us, or we were almost in a car accident, or there was this moment of gap that happened, right? And because we're trained toward ego, we think that's a bad thing. That's a beautiful thing. From the point of view of the Buddha's point of view, it's a wonderful thing every time something falls apart, because we have this moment to just be ourselves without all the artifacts, without all the structure, right? We could just be direct and simple. We don't have to clean ourselves off and preen again and get it all together. We could just let ourselves be just for a moment. I mean, maybe eventually we have to get ourselves together, and eventually we need to move on and change things and build other ego structures. But as meditation practitioners, we could begin to learn to slow the process down just enough, like my friend out there, just slow it down just enough that we create gaps, right? So it's not wall to wall ignorance. The last thing I want to say is that the basic premise of ego, the basic structure of it, the cause and condition of ego is ignorance. It's about not really seeing what's happening. It's about creating a wall that we project upon, a wall of preconceptions, a wall of ideas that we're bouncing off. And we wonder why people on the other side of that wall don't get us. We wonder why people on the other side of that wall aren't responding as we want them to. We wonder why people on the other side of that wall are not falling in love with us like we're falling in love with us, because we're just not sharing us with them. We're just sharing these concepts and these ideas. And we're keeping that separation going. And we talked about that a few classes back. It's called the dualistic, right? The dualistic separation. This idea that we're separate from everything else and that we have no commonality, that it's all about us, and our job is to manipulate that to get what we need. That's the very basic premise, is that we are not separate from everything else, that we suffer just like everyone else suffers. Our stories are individual, but the outcome are universal and the same. And that we could actually really find peace if we stop trying to proclaim the me of our experience, and start to see how the us and we of that experience maybe create some kind of solace, some kind of connection for ourselves.